let's start by thinking about, what happens, when we train teachers, right? Essentially, we bring teachers to a university, right, or a teacher training center, and typically, from what I read in the literature, what we do is we impart theory, right? We provide them the idea is, there's quite a few years of research on teaching. There's a lot of sort of a broad theoretical basis for this, and the purpose of university is to impart that theory to teachers. Now, what happens is they go out of the university and they go into a classroom, right? And then that theory doesn't stick because it's very abstract and it's very hard to apply it to concrete, specific context. So what happens to the theory? Well, usually, it goes out the window, right? Because you think, I have to deal with these real-world issues. That theory was very nice for university, got me my grades, but it just doesn't apply here. I'll just get along, right? So that's one of the challenges we're looking at. I mean, and then in a way, it gets worse because then we have people. This is Ben Goldacre, recently was commissioned by the UK government to write a position paper, and he says, there's a huge prize waiting to be claimed by teachers by collecting better evidence about what works best and establishing a culture where evidence is used as a matter of routine. We can improve outcomes for children, increase professional independence. So he's asking, not just do I want you to remember all that theory, you need to kind of be very scientific about your practice, right, and evidence-based. And this really isn't that new. I mean, this is David Hargreaves, 2007. Teaching is not at present a research-based profession. I have no doubt if it were, it would be more effective and more satisfying. So, as if teachers' life isn't hard enough, we're also asking them to be kind of scientific, right? What's the model of science that when people like Ben Goldacre or David Hargreaves as well, what's the implicit model of science? Again, Goldacre says, well, let's look at medicine. Right? Medicine has made huge progress by introducing randomized controlled trials, fair tests, comparing one treatment to another. If it works for medicine, then it should work for education, right? I mean, but there's something about education that's quite different. And here, I like John Dewey. So John Dewey, a philosopher of education, says, actively to participate in the making of knowledge is the highest prerogative of man and the only warrant of his freedom. So the purpose of schools, according to Dewey, is to enable students to actively participate in the creation of knowledge. Now, who signs up to that? I mean, does that align with your vision or ideal of education, of what education is about? Yeah? Any thoughts on this? I mean, does this match reality? Is this what education is in practice? Okay.
What I think about education is that it's related to the growing.
Growth, and that's really interesting because Dewey, when he talks about learning and education, he talks specifically about the idea of growth. And he says the idea of education is that you go through experiences which help you grow, and the idea of grow is that you'll be able to enjoy and benefit more from future experiences. So it's not just, it's being able to really benefit more from life by getting the tools and the capabilities which would help you deal with new experiences and get the most out of them. So you get a chocolate.
Thank you.
Right. Now this is Donald Schoon, And this is interesting because this is a paper that Donald Schoen wrote reflecting on Dewey's theory of inquiry. He says teaching tends to be seen as a process of delivering information and testing students for its reception and retention. Not only are we based on a model of delivering information and then validating, testing that it was received, but that it's kind of a closed system. So in effect, what you're learning is not something that would help you grow thinking of future experiences, but it's completely detached and disconnected. Even teachers are disconnected from their know. They teach math in ways that have little to do with how they do math. Right? So compare this to Dewey's vision. And why is this? I mean, why do we have this discrepancy? You know, we said ideally we'd like to see something like this, and in fact we have something like this. Can you suggest what's a cause of this gap?
What's that?
What's the cause? Why do we have this gap between what we'd like education to be and what it is in fact?
Well, I blame assessment processes for a lot of things.
Okay, explain.
Kind of gatekeeping. When you compare, say, primary education with young children who are creative, but then the whole process of getting a certification to go from A to B to C becomes really intrusive. That's one aspect.
So, thank you for that.
That was my motivation.
But I agree. I think the issue is, assessment or measuring, and the question is, are we measuring what we teach, or are we teaching what we can measure, right? Okay, so that's kind of, that's sort of my problem statement. Also kind of going back to that comparison, that medicine model of research. And you think about, medicine is about changing a person's physical condition predominantly. Education is about change of mind, change of practice. Right, and Lorillard says, education is not rocket science, it's much harder. The rocket science is about moving atoms. Education is about moving minds. Right? So it's a much more complex objective. In medicine, because we're changing physical conditions, we have quantifiable effects. Education, we're talking about complex effects. We're talking about, I might sort of sow a seed that will germinate and grow and having this effect 10 years after a student has left school. Education is predominantly universal. If you have a cold in Singapore or Barcelona, it's a cold. And you're probably, paracetamol will probably help you, right? But education is always very context dependent. The way we teach in a school in Barcelona or in a school in Singapore is inherently different, and there's no guarantee that the same solution would work here and there. So it falls into a category of what we call wicked problems. Right? And that's why Dan says, we should look at education, at teaching as a science, but not as a natural science, but as a design science. And just kind of, if you've never heard of design science, so my quick way to explain it is, science or natural science tells us what is, right? It describes reality. Social science tells us how bad it is. I should add, humanities tells us what is bad or what is good and bad. Design science is about how to make it better. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a separate scientific paradigm, which is much more applicable for research in education, and I'd say even practice in education. I'll get to that. So, educational design research, I think a tradition that goes back. Probably the seminal paper was Anne Brown's in 92, so that's kind of where we mark the start of a tradition of educational design research or design-based research in education. If you want to hear more, I'm giving a talk about this tomorrow. But basically, we go through a cycle which we start from usually we start from some theoretical theory, but we derive design conjectures from that theory. So we derive conjectures about change. We say, okay, here's a problem, here's something I want to improve in the system. Based on my knowledge of the theory, if I do this, it will have those effects. That's my conjecture. I then design artifacts, which could be activities, resources, technology, implement, put it into action, collect evidence, interpret it, and then analyze that evidence, evaluate it, and then feed back. So the thing is that design research is committed to feeding back both to practice and to theory. And that's just, so that's 2 minutes of educational design research. Like I said, there's a talk about this tomorrow. But let's go back to kind of thinking a bit about design in a bit more detail. We were talking about learning design. Assume we all have some notion of learning, but let's kind of think about design. And again, Donald Schoen talks about what he calls reflective conversation with materials of a situation. What does he mean by that? Anyone wants to take a guess? I mean, it rolls nicely on the tongue, but what does that mean? Reflective conversation with materials of a situation. Any ideas?
To understand what you are reading or interact with content.
Well, it is, but it's the idea is that as a designer or as a practitioner, I want to create some experiences. I create these experiences by changing artifacts, by changing materials, right? But what happens is that these materials talk back to me. So if I use this presentation, or if I don't know, I put this bottle. I used cookies to kind of encourage you to participate, right? That was my use of materials to induce some experience. But then I see, okay, it does get the effect I want, or doesn't get the effect I want. So there's a dialogue, conversation with materials, which there's an iterative process of introducing some physical change and observing its effect and adjusting. And that's a conversation that Schoen talks about. And he said it's a mode of inquiry, because inquire in the sense that I have some conjecture and I test it and I collect evidence and evaluate it. And it's a mode of design, right? Of making new things, and which respond to these conditions of complexity and uncertainty. So inquiry, again, Dewey's model of inquiry. And inquiry is a systematic, rigorous, critical process that proceeds from doubt to its resolution. So you start to inquire with some doubt, with something you don't, and you want to resolve that doubt, and you do it in a systematic, rigorous, critical way. It says the idea of inquiry challenges the dichotomy between abstract reasoning and is an abstract reasoning, but it's grounded in reality, and you do everything at the same time, right? It's combined reasoning action in the world. Okay, does that sound familiar? Reasonable? Yeah, I see a lot of people nodding, so I'll just move on from. Okay, so we talked about inquiry. What about design? Can somebody try to define design?
Creation within affordances and constraints.
All right. I'll go with that. Creation within, but creation of what or for what reason?
Depends what you're designing.
Okay.
We designed some processes and focusing on processes.
You're focusing on processes of design, or or you're designing processes.
I have designed different process to meet the students' need.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I'm not going to define it. I want to tell that given us design research, here in my case, your presentation so far reminds me more of what I know with the name of action research rather than design research. So design doesn't, from an engineering point of view, doesn't necessarily need to get into the action, building, testing, and everything, and then going back and reflecting. You can stop right before. For example, Charles Babbage designed the analytical engine, but he didn't build it, but he designed it. While your presentation takes you into the action, and then you need a reflective practitioner, not just a designer and then practitioners. So I would like you to comment.
Okay, that's a very interesting. I mean, you deserve 3 cookies because there are several interesting thoughts here. One is when we talk about design research, a lot of times we refer to research in engineering or also engineering, especially software engineering, economics, as design sciences. Because how do you research in engineering? What's the process of research?
Well, I would define design then as locating a problem or an opportunity, and then studying it, taking into account whatever theory which is relevant to that, devising some solution alternative, maybe more than one, thinking about criteria for evaluating and comparing them, choosing one of them, and taking it up to the point of trying it in reality, but not necessarily going.
Okay, so that's, the model that you describe of research in engineering is very close to my model of design science, and you'll see in a minute I'll refer to Herbert Simon, which Herbert Simon, who was the one who sort of coined the term design science. I agree that design in itself doesn't necessarily need to get to the point of implementation, because you can design something as a thought experiment, and you can share design ideas. Ideally, you would want to have some form of evaluation, even if you don't have the capacity to reach full implementation. And at the end of the day, the real, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? I mean, the real test that what you designed meets your objectives is when you implement and test it in the real world settings, right? But we will get back to those ideas, all of them, soon. So I mentioned Herbert Simon. Sciences of Artificial. His definition of design is everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into desired ones. And there's a lot folded into this sentence. First of all, it's the focus on change, right? So design is focused on change, and the idea of existing situations into desired ones, which means the design always has an ethical dimension to it. There's a value judgment here of what is a desired state of the world, right? And so immediately we waive any pretense of objectivity. And I think in education, we can never say that we're doing objective study of education, because we always have some ideas about what we'd like the people to learn or how we'd like them to learn. Right? So There's, Vitruvius talks about firmitas, utilitas, venicitas, or stability, utility, and delight, the three components of design. The idea is that something works, it's stable, it does what it's supposed to do, so it fills some function, and it has aesthetic value. And that's something we always, design always has, the aesthetic dimension to it. Bruno Latour, very interesting article, and he says quite a lot of things there, but one of the things he said that the more objects are turned into things, that is, the more matters of fact are turned into matters of concern, the more they are rendered into objects of design. Now, what does he mean by that? A piece of paper has physical qualities, right? It's a matter of fact, right? It has weight, it has some structural strengths, or so on. The minute I want to put it to use, then it becomes a matter of concern. It reflects my intentions, my desires. I have something riding on it, right? And that's when. So the idea about design really is about thinking not in terms of objects, in terms of their sort of detached, cold properties, but in terms of what they allow us to do, what they allow us to achieve, what concerns they address. Again, Pascal Begun talking about a learning process between users and designers, a mutual, so it goes back in a way to Schoen's idea of reflective conversation, not just with the materials, but with the user, between the designer and the user through the materials. John Hockenberry in a TED Talk talks about objects with intent, which for me kind of resonates Latour's idea of matters of concern versus matters of fact. Okay? And finally, Louis Sullivan, great American architect, coined the term form follows function. So when we design something, we create new forms which try to achieve certain function. Now, of course, this was a very modernist view of design, and it then been challenged. And the question of where does aesthetic fit into this? Are there something beyond what we can call, very strict function that impacts design? And so there, of course, we can sit and talk about this probably for a full term or a full lifetime, what is design. But that's to give you a brief sense of what I'm talking about. So the question is education a design practice? What do you think?
If education
is education a design practice? Are educators inherently designers? Yeah? Explain.
For example, I can explain some process using some information tools much better, because the visualization and such kind things help to understand some processes better than just to write and describe processes.
Mm-hmm.
So the activity-based teaching is much more important than that students can experience real processes, not just to learn and know that such kind of process exists.
Yeah. Do you want to say something? Yeah.
I agree that education, as far as I know it, at least in my fields, if it is not, it should be.
Okay.
Well, I was going to ask if you ask him, is it or should it be? Because I think very often, and also in some situations, I think you see there's a double role. Somebody is designing and somebody is facilitating. So is the person facilitating a designer? I'm not sure.
Well, there is this tension between what we call design, learning design, and orchestration. And I see orchestration as more of a real-time element of teaching. So, think of it almost as improvisation theater, right? So you set the props and you write a script, but then you get on stage and you respond to your audience. So now, of course, your ability to respond effectively and orchestrate in real time depends on the quality of your design beforehand. But the other issue I think that seems to come out of the questions here is, are educators explicit about their design processes? And that, again, I'll go back to Shun, which says that most people engage in design in a very tacit manner. So, yes, we think about, okay, what am I going to do this year or next week or tomorrow in class? We do plan ahead. We do try to engender certain changes in our teachers' minds, in our students' minds, but we're not explicit about it, and we don't share the way we do it, and we don't share our design knowledge. And that's where the whole field of learning design comes in trying to make that process explicit. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about some topic that some will have around the word design, and I understand why. Since it comes basically from design or art, education, engineering, and all that. So people link design to products, to tangible industrial products, such as a car. And then they have problems in linking this type of thing to something which is not a product. And I agree that education, for example, is not a product of you can simply sterilize, package, and sell as a product. It's more a service. But then you need to think of design applied to education as designing a service, which has actors, as processes, as utilities, and whatever. But from the beginning, understanding that you're going to design something which is not a product, but a service.
That's right. A lot of the education work is invisible because, again, as a teacher, you might produce some resources, and yes, if those resources are visually better designed, then they get their effect better. But a lot of work is just kind of social interaction. It's setting students challenges and tasks and monitoring their progress, and then steering them to the right path, to an effective path, let's put it. And all that is it. You don't really think, externalize it. And the product of what you do is an educational practice. It's not something that leaves any permanent record. So that, again, those are all challenges for us when we talk about learning design and the importance of learning design. And part of the work that's done in the learning design community is how do you represent these invisible processes, these invisible practices, right? How do you say, okay, when I'm going to set a question for the students and then give them so much time to work on it, and then ask one student what he thinks and ask another student what he thinks, and then get them to discuss or debate their different solutions and then reach some conclusion. That's a whole process which a lot of teachers do every day, and it's valuable to capture that and to say, give it some embodiment, some kind of physical reality, so that we can talk about it and say, this is what I do in class, this is what I've designed, and this is what the effects of this design are. Right. So again, we get back to this process of design research, but the problem is that we started from saying, okay, there's a call for teachers to be more evidence-based, more scientific in their practice. We can't really expect a teacher to go through all of this, right? It's just too much to ask of a practitioner. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the skills. But what seems to be possible is to look at teacher inquiry. So again, we think about Dewey's model of inquiry-based learning, and there's then a very long established tradition of inquiry-based learning. What about inquiry-based professional development? And we're seeing more and more evidence that actually inquiry-based professional development is very powerful in terms of building teachers' competencies. Right? Much more powerful than this idea of imparting packaged knowledge and then figure out what to do with in the classroom. Okay? So this is just one model from the Nextel project of teacher inquiry into student learning. And again, there are other works on teacher inquiry and teacher inquiry as professional development. There's also, this is a model of inquiry-based learning, which is developed by the Inquire project. So the idea, I mean, the typical cycle of inquiries, you find a topic, you formulate a question, you plan your research methods, collect evidence, analyze it, reach conclusions, share and reflect on those conclusions, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're mimicking a scientific process, but taking it, projecting it into practical context, so making it accessible and available for, in this case, children or adult learners, but when we talk about teacher development, then it would be teachers. So if we combine those two models, we take on one hand the idea of inquiry, teacher inquiry as a model for professional development, and on the other hand the idea of design research as a scientific paradigm, I get to what I call the design inquiry of learning cycle. So the idea is that teachers imagine, they define an educational challenge which they want to address, they investigate the context in which that challenge is embedded, because we said design is always, and education is always context specific, so you need to get some description of the context in which you're operating. You review relevant theories, as you said, also relevant examples of what other people have done in similar situations. These examples could be captured in case studies or design narratives or in design patterns or various forms of kind of capturing past experience. Then you go through a process of ideation, of conceptualizing a solution, prototyping it, and evaluating, right? And that goes back actually to what you said about, you can't really always get all the way down to a final product in its real settings, right? And especially if we're talking about practitioner inquiry, it's really a lot of times unrealistic to expect practitioners to come up with some amazing educational innovation and actually test it in class with real students. But there are certain ways that you can evaluate things even in a conceptual or prototype phase. If you do get down to actually to the field, it's even better. But it's important to actually have that evaluation even in an early stage. And then evaluate and reflect, and I should also say share and discuss. I mean, you can see they're talking about their reflection, so there is obviously a social element.
Sorry, Yishay.
Yes.
Please give us an example of using this. Using this with a team of teachers, or.
Well, maybe you can give us an example, right? You were here yesterday. Does it sound familiar?
A little bit familiar, but we are not exactly using this kind of techniques.
Well, no, yeah. So I said we use something similar to this cycle, but in a very condensed form yesterday in the workshop that we did here, and I'll give some examples of where I've used this.
It sounds wonderful. It's just that I'm also imagining that from the point of view of the teacher, it can represent a lot of work. They have to imagine a lot of situations that can happen during the semester, and they have to, let's say, apply the full method for everything. Like so, our teachers are really busy, so it's very important to find out.
So the trick is to scale it down to the right, what you call the right grain size. So you can, obviously, you can apply this to a whole pedagogical approach, right? And you can apply this to just one activity. So, you can do this as a scale of effectively designing a 15-minute activity. Okay, you really have to play with that grain size to get something that is feasible for the teachers to do, but also exciting enough for them to enjoy and benefit and learn from it. And yes, it is an active model, which means it does require a lot from the learner. Right? Any form of, if you think about inquiry learning, project-based learning, any form of active learning demands more from the learner, but it also gives them something in return. Right? Just sitting in class and daydreaming while somebody talks is easier.
In fact, I had a different question, is how do you introduce this method of design into a group of teachers? So how do you facilitate it? How do you support teachers?
Okay, so I'll get to that in a few minutes. Yeah? But any questions about sort of the model itself at this point? I know it's a bit abstract, so maybe it'll make more sense when we go on, but yes.
Well, again, what I've seen in other areas, just in engineering, also in health sciences, and usually under the name of action research, but having a design part and an action part, is that something which has worked is to establish teams where someone has the role of researcher that knows enough about the problem to help research, and someone has the role of practitioner. Of course, reflective practitioner, someone interested in inquiring about how to improve his or her practice. And then it is the collaboration of these two figures, these two roles, through these cyclical approach that things come out, rather than to try to convert practitioners into researchers or researchers into also practitioners.
So I think, and I've heard a lot of times that people say, oh, it sounds similar to action research, and I think, I'm not an expert in action research, but my view is that what you describe actually puts a finger on the difference between design research and action research. In action research, there's still a separation between action and research in a sense. There's still a separation between practice and theory. Whereas design research, as I said, there's that dual commitment. We need to feed on theory and practice, and we need to then inform both theory and practice. So the two are really intertwined throughout. And that's why, yes, we do, I mean, the method I use, usually people do work in teams, but these teams are more on an equal status. So I am demanding that, that practitioners will read educational theory and see how it applies to their practice, rather than have these two separate roles. Okay, so now this is not, in a way, not new, not completely new. I mean, there's work, Brenda Bannon did work on teachers and design researchers, so there's a very interesting chapter about the model of engaging teachers in design research as a form of professional development. There's a lot of work on teachers as designers. And there's evidence that actually training teachers as learning designers ends up not only improving their practical skills, but also improving their theoretical skills. So actually, by forcing them to put theory into practice, they get a better grasp of theory as well. It also, in a way, relates to the pedagogy of learning by design, which is related generally to the pedagogy of constructionism. So again, there's the idea that we get kids to learn, usually in areas of math and science, by designing artifacts. And like I said, well, if it's a good pedagogy, then it should also work for teachers' professional development. Okay? So that's kind of the model of design inquiry learning, but how do we actually teach it, right? What's my educational practice of promoting this? So here again, I look at other design disciplines. If anybody has a friend or relative or somebody who's studied architecture, graphical design, product design, then you'd know that they spend hours on end at a studio. Right? The studio is a dominant model of instruction in design disciplines. Okay, so let's think about what happens in the studio. Okay, anybody familiar with the idea of a studio in, say, architecture education or any other design discipline? No? So, well, my wife's an architect, so I knew that, that's why I'm familiar with it. I was, essentially what happened, you can see even in the images, if you can make out students work either individually or in teams on their design projects, right? And you'd see the teacher, here is a good example. You see students are discussing a design project and the teacher is kind of standing at the side and perhaps asking questions, provoking, challenging them, guiding them, right? Here you see a student presenting his work to his peers. So again, there's a lot of practice of, you work on something, you get constant feedback and guidance from your tutor, but then every so often you present your work and you get feedback from your peers. That peer feedback works in both ways. So if you give me feedback, I learn from it, but also you learn from it, right? So that's so that's kind of the model of studio. There's a paper that describes it. How do we apply this to learning design, right? So that's what I've been working on for the last few years, what I call the Learning Design Studio. I'm not the only one to do this, so there's a paper there by Cox, Harrison, and Hodley about using a studio model in learning technology design. But I've used it in several different occasions in both face-to-face online courses, workshops as well, and I'll kind of briefly go through this. So the process I go through is first we have typically what we call a dream bazaar, where people come in, the students come into class and they sort of fantasize and say, okay, what would you like to change? Think about the context in which you teach and tell me one thing that you'd like to see different in that context. Just your wildest dream, one small thing that you'd like to change, right? Then you form teams. So ideally, like I said, you'd like to, people present their ideas of what they'd like to do, and they form team based on shared interests, and these are project teams which will work throughout the studio. Okay. There could be variants on this, because you could use this methodology with organic teams. So if you have, say, course teams that come together to do a workshop, they might already work with their organic team. Could form teams ad hoc. The next bit is investigating the context, and there I use we use personas in the workshop today, force maps, so other representation like factors and concerns tables and so on. So I really kind of try to even take your existing intuitive knowledge, you are already familiar with your context, but I want you to externalize that knowledge, share it, formulate it in a way that we can manipulate it and come back to it later. Ideally, if we have more time, then I'll send you off to do some ethnographic studies. So for instance, in a course on games and learning, I had a group of teachers actually survey their students about their habits and their attitudes towards gaming. And because that provides you data that you can build on then when you do your design project. Then these slides, by the way, most of them are from the old MOOC, which we ran last year. So the idea of connecting, again, it's a lot of time we look at either pedagogical principles, pedagogical patterns. So these are both forms of distilling design knowledge from practice, but we'd also look at case studies, design narratives, practice reports, and so on. So really looking for examples which are similar to what you're trying to achieve and learn from what other people have done in the past. Then conceptualize. So I want to, let's see, no, sorry. So this is an example of, oh, come on. Ooh. Of the music, so you can. This is from a course I ran, and this is a storyboard. But the reason I show this, it doesn't look like it's an animated storyboard, right? But it's a conceptual representation of a solution, right? And it's done in graphical form. It gets the idea across of what the activity would be like and what the so it has kind of a narrative element, sequential element to it. It's something we can discuss. We can give feedback on the idea at this form, and then they can implement it and test it in practice. This particular team, they came up with a very nice idea. They presented it very nicely in the storyboard. They implemented it. It collapsed. It didn't work, and that's fine. You know, I mean, if you would know beforehand that everything you do works, then you don't have anything to learn. Right? So that's something we need to be very clear about when we engage teachers in this kind of learning, that success is not guaranteed. But actually, if your experiment failed but you learned from it, then in terms of your learning experience, it is a success. And sometimes you learn much more from failures than from successes. So that's storyboarding. And then there's prototyping. So this is again another student group, and I'll turn off the music as well. They designed a mobile game, a mobile location-based game. The idea was this was a mix. Why did I get these ads? The idea, it was a mixed group of Jewish and Palestinian students which live quite close by. So they live, there's Jewish towns in Israel and Palestinian towns, and they don't really engage. And they thought one thing we can engage about is it's about shared history. So we live in an area which has, say, Roman remains, Greek remains, so on. We can build an activity which takes people out to the field, to their natural habitat, to learn about the history of the place, to learn and realize that we live on the same land which has the same history, and have that as a basis for getting to know each other and finding common grounds. They then piloted their design by developing a prototype app and testing it with their families. Okay? So that's an example of how you could prototype and evaluate something without actually going out to 500 students from 3 different cities. Okay, so then again, after you prototype, you evaluate, and of course you need to find evaluation methods which are appropriate for whatever it is you're designing at whatever level you get it to. Reflect, which is, it's very important to take a stop and kind of think back about the whole process and really be explicit about what it is that you've learned through it. Okay? So that's kind of roughly the whole path that students do in this learning design studio model. Any questions at this point or comments?
Can you describe me what is is the difference between prototype and conceptual model?
So a conceptual model would be typically something that you could do on a piece of paper in a classroom, right? It's much more open-ended. It's much quicker to produce, right? A prototype will already have some elements of implementation. So when you move from your conceptual model or your to prototype, what you do is you say, okay, in order to implement this conceptual model, I would need, I don't know, 3 years, 3 million euros, right? I can't do that, but I can implement these 5 features, and I can give some simulation of these 6 features so that I can actually create a coherent experience which is close in some way to the experience which I would like to induce with my full design. Okay? So the idea is really to have something that you can experience in the real world, that it's not a full implementation, it's just the quickest thing that you can produce that gives some sense of what the implementation would be like. Does that make sense?
So, and what's the difference between conceptual model and conceptual process?
Conceptual model and conceptual process. I'm not sure I understand the question, so maybe you can elaborate.
If you have new idea how to improve processes, this is conceptual process.
Oh, it could be a model, a conceptual model of a process, right? So in your case, you're designing processes. Somebody else might be designing artifacts or technology, right? So if you're designing a process and you need a way to describe that process and you need a way to model the process. So you might have a conceptual model of the process and then a prototype of the process and then a full-scale implementation of it. Okay?
Is this an alternative to the traditional idea of teacher training? So traditionally,
it's both an alternative and a complementary method, because it might be that you can build a whole training program on this model. You'd be very brave if you do that. Because this is in some ways a very demanding model, both for the teachers and for the learners. And it might actually make sense to balance it with some more traditional classes as well. So, just intuitively, I'd say if you want to think about in terms of curriculum design, I'd have some courses which are more traditional seminars or just frontal teaching, and some courses which are more design-based. Another thing is that sometimes after you engage people students in such a design cycle, which is very intensive, you might want to say, okay, now you step back, and they spend the next term reflecting, analyzing, and revisiting the literature, and say writing an essay about that experience. So again, there's various other pedagogical practices which you might want to intermix. Okay. Any more? Again, going back to Dewey, the belief that all genuine education comes about through experience does not mean that all experiences are genuinely or equally educative. Okay. So, yes, okay, I think that you learned by experience. I showed you a model of some educational experience. Does it really work? Well, what I can say is I've tried it in several, so for instance, the University of Haifa, I tried it with 2 courses. One had 22 students, which were all teachers, and they came up with 9 projects. The other one was 17 students, about half of them teachers, half of them either teachers in training or education practitioners which are not teachers. They come up with about 6 projects. It was a 13-week semestral course in both cases. Blended learning approach, so we would meet once a week in class, but then have a lot of activity through Google Sites and forums and mailing lists and so on between sessions. Students would also meet to work on their projects, either physically or virtually between sessions. And students invested between 4 and 10 hours a week in this. Right, so it's quite a high demand course, I think. This is an example of one project. I won't go into the actual project sites because time is running short and I want to have some time for discussion. But generally, this project was around teaching of biology. So high school biology, the top level of biology in high school in Israel, students have to do a field research project. The problem when they do this field research project is they sort of lose contact with a teacher. So this team of 3 students investigated that problem by interviewing teachers, interviewing students, understanding where the gaps are, and presenting them some alternative in terms of using mobile and web technology to address those gaps. They developed a prototype which is inherently a Google site which had some mobile elements associated with it, and they tested that with one class, with one teacher and I think about 9 students. Right? So they took various theories of mobile learning and they put them into practice in a very concrete context and did some thorough evaluation of that. One of the interesting things about this is usually you run a university course. At the end of the course there's a survey. Students say how happy they are with your teaching. Right? And these courses, generally at the end of the course, some students liked it, some students less. All of them said that they worked very hard. And well, I worked very hard too. But part of it was because it was sort of experimental. So probably, if I would run this course again today, both me and the students would work less. Part of it was because, like I said, project-based collaborative learning is demanding. It draws you in. You but this is a survey I ran 2 years after the course, right? So that's not immediately after they finished it, but 2 years after. And the question, the course, so a typical Likert scale, 0 to 5. 0 means not at all, 5 very much, right? The course enhanced my theoretical knowledge. As you can see, about everybody says yes. Enhanced my practical knowledge, most of them said yes. And then the contrary question, made a minor contribution to the knowledge, no. Enriched and broadened my practice, provided tools I use in my work. So you see, this indicates, and it's a small sample. I'll grant that. It's just 2 courses and about 60% responded to the survey. But generally you see that people say that it enhanced both their theoretical and their practical knowledge and influenced their teaching practice, and this is 2 years old. I kind of felt, that's nice. And that's just a quote from one of the students saying the course opened up new possibilities. 2 years after the end of the course, I continued to apply what I learned. My pedagogical design took a turn. Thanks and good luck. That feels nice to hear a student say that. Then I used a similar model in old MOOC, which is a MOOC learning design that I ran last year. So, 9-week MOOC, over 2,000 people registered, about 1,000, 1,500 showed up on the first week. We were expecting people to invest between 3 and 10 hours a week. In fact, I think most people invested between 1 and 3 hours or less. We had about 100 to 300 visitors on the project site a day, and used a variety of, it was completely online with a whole mishmash of technologies. So our evaluations to show that, people kind of engage to an extent with the ideas of design inquiry, but not really. So there's a whole group project element didn't quite work here. And again, if you want, we can discuss this later about why that sort of learning design studio model didn't quite work in the MOOC. So people did feel they got a lot out of it, but just the model itself wasn't effective. Then one of the OU MA in Open and Distance Education modules, a block out of a 30-week model, a 7-week block, 70 students, expected effort of 14 hours a day, but that includes tuition and individual work as well. Used, again, a variety of technologies to support this. About 11 projects produced in this instance. All of them quite amazing quality, so students really did very serious work, very innovative, very thorough. My impression was, and some of the feedback I got indicated that they learned a lot from this, but evaluation is still in progress. So, and I've left the OU, so I can't, I don't have access to the data at the moment. So it's, I think it worked, but the evidence is still not clear cut. This is a workshop we ran here yesterday. And that's just a demonstration of a situation where I couldn't implement the process at full scale, but I did take elements of that process. We had a 2-hour workshop. We have an agenda for 8 hours. So the idea is that then participants in the workshop can come back to it later if they want. And as you see, they worked in groups, they did some modeling of their context, and they did some storyboarding. We didn't really get as far as evaluation or implementation, of course, but we had a good time. So that's it. So again, so design inquiry models, there's a couple of papers which are recently published about this, so you can read that in detail. And that's it. Thank you.